Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How Diet Influences Mental Health and Resilience, given by Dr. Bonnie Kaplan. I just want to say my name is Andrew Zito. I am the director of our campus mental health strategy. And what you're seeing here today is a part of You Flourish, which is going on right now. Before we start and then have Bonnie talk a little bit more about her research and her recommendations, I want to just acknowledge that we would like to we're on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So welcome to this event. Again, this event is part of You Flourish. You Flourish has been going on for approximately 7 years now, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. And we can see the impact of You Flourish all across campus. So go onto the website ucalgary.ca mental health /mental health /You Flourish to get more information about all the great events that we have going on during You Flourish this time around. I just want to mention that, supports for You Flourish. You Flourish, again, has been going on for quite a while now. It is a joint venture, a partnership, a collaboration between Student Wellness Services as well as Staff Wellness, and is supported by the Campus Mental Health Strategy. And you can see all the information there to access supports and all the resources that we have for mental health. I want to introduce Dr. Bonnie Kaplan. She said not to give her bio because her bio is amazing, but I think you've all received it. So you please go look and go look her up and look at all the great things she's done. But I want to introduce you, Bonnie. Welcome. Thank you for doing this for us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Andrew, and thank you also for the nice introduction. So I'm going to share my screen. There's always this awkward moment of silence while the speaker does this so that we do it right. But I think that's up there now, right? Can you see it? And can you see my cursor moving? I see a thumbs up. Thank you for the feedback. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for your interest. I do enjoy talking about this topic because it's a passion of mine, even though I'm retired. And I want to mention, I'm going to focus on the aspects of the topic that we agreed upon earlier, which are really how diet influences mental health, what the data show, and also particularly on resilience, which I think in a university community is very important. The most important thing about my first slide is my website, and I'll show it to you again later. Be sure to use my middle initial because it's got lots of resources, and you can also email me there on the contact tab. Now, it's conventional to have a disclosure slide, and it's very important to me. I have no commercial interest in any company or the sale of any product, and I've been saying that for like 20 years. And then when my former student, Julia Ruckledge, and I published The Better Brain a year and a half ago, somebody said, you do have a conflict of interest, but so I guess I do, The Better Brain. However, my goal isn't to sell books. And it made me think about, well, what is my goal? I'm retired now. I'm not filling out annual reports. My goal is really to influence the redesign of our mental health treatment systems where we place nutrition at the table, if you'll pardon the pun, and to empower people with education about that. So that's why I'm delighted to speak to this audience. And I also, by the way, want to encourage young scientists to study this topic. So let's begin with this question. Do you really know what our society is consuming? I'm going to use American data here only because it's just from the last 6 months, but it is completely consistent with Canadian data and also data from the UK. The US government has an occasional survey called NHANES. Many of you will have heard of it, I imagine. It stands for the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and it's 50 years old, started in 1971. And they monitor how Americans are eating and what they're eating. And then scientists come along and they analyze the data. So this is from analyses that are less than 6 months old. And it is very disturbing. In fact, it's probably the most disturbing thing I've seen in recent years. According to the NHANES data, 2/3 of the caloric intake of our young Americans, but you could put in Canadians there, and over 50% of the caloric intake of adults is not coming from food. It's coming from industrialized, ultra-processed chemicals in packages. And I know you know what that is. Put a few pictures on the side in case you've forgotten that these are not food. Food is defined as what we must consume to build our cells and to enable our cells to work properly. There is almost nothing in these products which are doing that. And what we have now is a mass social experiment, societal experiment, where we have our entire westernized societies choosing to eliminate half of the nutrient intake that our parents, grandparents, and ancestors consumed. So you have to wonder what that's going to do. Oh, by the way, just in case you don't know what's at the other end of the continuum, but I know you all do. The other end of the continuum from that ultra-processed, chemically packaged stuff is whole foods, or what Dr. Andrew Weil called years ago, true food, minimally processed food, real food. So we all know that nutrition is the foundation of our resilience. It's not the be all and end all. It doesn't determine who we are or how we function. There are so many other variables, but it's the foundation that everything builds on. So given the numbers I just gave you, I hope you're wondering what happens to people who have eliminated 50% of the nutrient intake that they could or should be consuming. We don't have a lot of data that directly answers that question, but there is one amazingly relevant study, and I want to show it to you. So after World War II, partly because of the people who were released from the camps, the concentration camps as survivors, also from people who lived through experiences like the Dutch hunger winter, people were acutely aware that we don't really understand starvation in many ways. And a number of people unfortunately died during the refeeding process because people didn't know how to refeed them. And so the University of Minnesota conducted a series of experiments, and almost all of them were in the physical realm, looking at gastrointestinal activity, etc. One study looked at mental health. They took 36 normal, healthy men, and they asked the question, what would happen to them if for 6 months they consumed half of the normal caloric and nutrient intake that they usually did. Now, this is not exactly analogous to our current situation because we know that our society has not cut back on calories, but we do know they have cut back by over 50% in terms of the nutrient intake. And by that, I particularly mean the micronutrient intake, not the macronutrients, proteins, fats, etc. And so it's interesting, it's not definitive, but interesting to look at the results of that study. These are the symptoms that emerged, and this is in 1950s language, but what you have here are all the symptoms of depression, anxiety, things like self-harm they called self-mutilation, and even something about ADHD, inability to concentrate. So we know, and by the way, there's a lot more data from the developing world showing that these symptoms indicate inadequate micronutrient intake. So we know that this is a very important problem. And we also know that there's this tremendous increase in mental health problems. Please do not walk away from this talk and say, Kaplan said that nutrition explains everything. Once again, there's nothing more complicated than human behavior. Many things have changed since, say, 1960, the middle of this graph, when the prevalence rate of mental disorders was less than 1%. But nutrition, in my opinion, is the most overlooked factor. And again, it is fundamental. It's the foundation, which gives us the ability to benefit from many of the other factors that we know influence mental health. So 0.03%. In the 1960s, I was still in school. I am shocked that now mental health, and you probably know this, is the point prevalence is 20%. The lifetime prevalence, that's 20% is a cut in time, right? But the lifetime prevalence is 50%. If you had told me when I was in school studying experimental psychology that the lifetime prevalence of mental health disorders would be 50%, I would have been utterly just in disbelief because it was so rare, so uncommon. So we do have something that has changed since the 1960s. Obviously, the psychopharmacology revolution has not solved these problems, or else mental health disorder prevalence rate would be going down. So how do we know that we usually call it hidden brain hunger. People, especially in Canada, use the term food insecurity, which is very, very relevant. But sometimes I think it downplays the fact that what we're talking about is starvation at the brain level. But anyway, how do we know that this lack of micronutrient intake is relevant to mental health? By the way, I don't think I mentioned this. I use the word micronutrient mostly to refer to minerals and vitamins. Okay. So one way we can know that is to return to the wisdom of our ancestors. And if I had an extra 45 minutes, I would track the historical knowledge back approximately 3,000 years. But I don't have time to do that. But I like to always cite at least one historical reference to give you an idea that this is not new. We are rediscovering what was old knowledge. What I usually cite is the People's Home Library, partly because to me, this is not ancient. 1910 just happens to be the year that my father was born. Okay, so to me, it's almost the present era. I know it's not for many of the people listening here, but you don't have as much gray hair as I do. At any rate, it was also practical knowledge for people living out here in the West, the homesteaders, both in Canada, excuse me, and the US. It taught them everything they needed to know about health and how to run a home, etc. And if you look at what the collected wisdom was for mental health, you'll find that they say it very simply. The number one cause of they called it acquired insanity. In other words, the emergence of a mental health problem was imperfect nutrition. Go feed them better. By the way, no stigma attached with that. It just kills me sometimes when governments are throwing money out constantly saying, let's get rid of the stigma. Well, we could get rid of a lot of the stigma if people would look at the nutrition literature. It's really a matter of suboptimal nutrition or imperfect nutrition, which recognizes the unique individuality and individual differences I'll mention later. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be talking about two things. What do micronutrients really do for our brains? How do they do it? And then I'll come back and talk about the evidence base. Our brain is our greediest organ, and that may surprise many of you, but I can prove it. It is only about 2% of our body weight, so you would think it would represent about 2% of our metabolism and the metabolic demands upon our nutrients. But you would be wrong. Even at rest, the brain is pulling at about 10 times its weight, and it represents at least 20% of metabolic demands. And during times of stress, crisis, or just activity, concentration, etc., it goes much higher. Some people like to envision this in terms of what we know about our blood flow. I mean, the way our brain gets those micronutrients is that we have eaten them, we have been able to absorb them, and they go into our bloodstream and circulate throughout our brain and body. Excuse me, each of us has about 4 to 6 liters of blood, and almost 25% of it is in our little tiny 2% brains every single minute. Part of that is because we have this incredibly complex vasculature in the human brain, but also you have to ask why we've evolved this way. And it's a reminder to me to say, again, the story is not simple. It's not just because of delivering micronutrients to the brain. We need oxygen. That's rather important. That blood flow removes waste products, etc. But it's an interesting way to look at the problem. I'm going to teach you very elementary information about brain metabolism. And I want to tell you that I teach this down to grade 6 whenever I can. And so don't be put off by the diagrams. I'm going to explain to you that in order to transform, and I know some of you know this way better than I do, I know it's quite a mixed audience, but if your brain or body has to convert chemical A to chemical B, it's almost always an enzymatic reaction to get from A to B. But the enzymes don't work alone. And so why are we not teaching people that every single enzymatic reaction is dependent upon cofactors? where do we get the cofactors? Cofactors incorporate minerals and vitamins. And so the diagram that I've been showing for 15 years, at least 20 years maybe, to lay audiences, to people of all ages, to physicians, to children in elementary school, begins with this very, very simplified, abridged part of tryptophan metabolism. And the reason I chose tryptophan is that everybody, even back then, had heard the words tryptophan and serotonin. And so I put those in red as well as melatonin, just because people recognize them. You don't need to worry about what any of these other words are. The point is that this is a tiny bit of brain metabolism, and every single arrow is an enzymatic reaction. And you can go online and you can click on every single enzymatic reaction and ask the question, which cofactors, which vitamins and minerals are required for that enzymatic step to be optimally functioning? And what you will find is always vitamins and minerals. And sometimes there'll be trace minerals like molybdenum that you may never have heard of. Many of them in the brain are involve B vitamins and many of the other kinds of minerals that you've heard of. And sometimes there are quite a few of them for a single step, okay? Where do they come from? They should be flowing through our brains every minute of every day if we are eating them, but we have to make the choice to eat them. Now, my colleague at Oregon Health and Science University, Dr. Jenny Johnstone, was concerned because all of us who study micronutrients are giving talks on this all the time, and concerned that people might think that this is unique to serotonin, and it is not. So she drew a small portion, again, simplified, of the dopamine pathway. She did it in a circular form, but it's the same message. And what you can see in the green letters are all the micronutrients that are required for optimal enzymatic reaction at every step. And finally, I like to show this one because I can't spend enough time on the omega-3s. You all know we should be eating fish, getting our omega-3s. We get too many omega-6s in proportion if we're eating processed food. But what you might not realize is that to get the precursors in the omega-3 metabolic line metabolized down to EPA and DHA that you've probably heard of, that you, again, what do you need? You need here a whole set of cofactors at this step, and here in red. Okay, so it's true everywhere. I also have a slide for mitochondrial function and ATP, but it's too much for this audience. I think I need to move on. The point is, our human mammalian physiology is dependent upon optimizing the nutrient input to avoid what I call sluggish pathways. In fact, I sometimes say we should ditch the DSM and just diagnose people with sluggish pathways, but it's an oversimplification. Even I know that. Okay, so one of the things that's a very important takeaway from looking at these pathways is you should never ask anybody, which vitamin or mineral should I take to optimize my brain function? Because our brains don't work that way. And yet our funding agencies still fund that way. They want to fund studies on a single nutrient at a time, and they never show much. Pardon me. For those of you who didn't hear me say it before, I'm just getting over COVID. I have a little bit of a cough and a catch in my throat. And I apologize for it, but I'll bet some of you have had it too. So you know what it's like. So now I've lost my train of thought. The point is that it is makes no sense to expect magic out of a single nutrient. We need so many of them, and they tend to work together. So that's magical thinking. And I don't want to be a magical thinker, nor do you. So the question we should ask is, well, what do we need then for optimal functioning? And the list is very long. If you stick with micronutrients, we can certainly identify approximately 15 vitamins and 15 minerals. We know about essential fatty acids, but there are a few thousand phytonutrients, many of which don't have names yet. We don't know fully what they do yet, but you can only get, they're packaged. Mother Nature packaged them in our crops with our vitamins and minerals. So they must be doing something good for us. And so this is a good reason to be a food first kind of person. But for neurotransmitter synthesis and breakdown, you need all of these things. You need the essential fatty acids for building strong cellular walls. And also from, as I mentioned, mitochondrial production of ATP. It's the energy molecules dependent upon adequate amounts of minerals and vitamins. So I need to move to the evidence base. It's really important to me that people learn something about this. But now you know why the evidence base shows clearly more benefit for broad spectrum micronutrient formulas or for broad kinds of diverse diets, because our brains need all of that. And one of the reasons I spend so much time on biochemical pathways is, in my opinion, the Western world has been teaching people for over 50 years, eat a healthy diet. Our dietitians have been telling us, eat a healthy diet. And yet, over half of what our society is consuming now, 2/3 for our children, is junk. Obviously, people are not changing their behavior. People tell me, and I don't have scientific data on this, maybe someone would study it, but people tell me that once they understand not just what they should do, but why, a light bulb goes off. And when they know why they should be diversifying their diet, eating whole foods, etc., and because they need to feed those biochemical pathways, it really motivates them to do that. So it might be the key to improving people's motivation for changing their behavior. So let's talk about the evidence, though. I don't know how many of the audience are scientists, but I spent my career doing clinical research, so this is very important to me. I want you to understand that this is not flaky research. It's vast amount of research, and it demonstrates efficacy of treatment, and it also improves resilience. So here's an overview of the types of evidence. There are at least 15 population-based correlational studies, and I'm going to show you just one slide about them because, as we all know, correlation doesn't prove causation, so I don't want to dwell on them. But then to prove causality, we have about 4 prospective longitudinal studies and then about 75 treatment studies. And no, I won't show them all to you because we'd all be asleep by then and Andrew would be saying, shut up already. So I'm going to give you examples and illustrations. So here's my one summary slide about correlational studies. All of those population-based studies, and they come from Australia, Finland, Spain, the UK, I mean, not much from the US, oddly enough, certainly Australia, or maybe I said that already. They all show that in large groups of people, those who are eating a dietary pattern that has more real food, whole foods, have fewer symptoms of depression and anxiety than people whose diets are primarily focused on ultra-processed packaged so-called food. A couple of studies show that isolating the variable that you might be called fruit and vegetable intake accounts for a lot of the relationship, although not all of it. And I put one in here just because it came out, I think, just 2 weeks ago. A 2022 study of dietary intake and vulnerability to COVID found that intake of fruits and veggies was uniquely correlated with self-reported well-being, but it's still correlational, okay? Correlational studies are good for giving us clues as to what to study next. But in this area, I don't think we need more correlational studies showing that people who eat better feel better. So let's go on to causality. To prove causality, first of all, I'm going to talk about prospective longitudinal studies. Now, what we do in a situation like that is we go in and we take people who are exhibiting no mental health problems, and we characterize their dietary pattern. And then we step back and wait, in some cases 2 years, in the study from Spain about 6 years, and we ask who develops a diagnosed diagnosed mental health problem, or who gets referred for mental health treatment, etc. Some measure of the emergence of mental disorders. So, and what they show, by the way, consistently is a confirmation of the correlational study. So I'm going to show you one study in that area and then come back to treatment. The one that I picked out is Canadian, but it's not for that reason that I picked it out. And it was published in Pediatrics, which is the primary publication of the American Pediatric Society. But the reason I picked it out is because it's in young children. And this is a group primarily from Paul Voigtler's group at the University of Alberta, and they have shown the vulnerability of our young children. I mean, what are we doing to our kids? We are letting them get used to eating sugar and processed, ultra-processed food, and it's really causing problems. So here's what they did. They had about 3,000 children who were aged 10 to 11. In 2011, they went in and characterized all of their behaviors according to 9 health recommendations. 6 of those were on dietary intake. So, number of servings of fruits and vegetables a day, things like that. The other 3 were on screen time and physical activity. And again, following like the Pediatric Society guidelines on those. And they categorized the children as to how many of those recommendations they were meeting. Then they went away. Then they came back in 2 to 3 years, and they pulled the administrative health data and asked the question, who was referred to a pediatrician because of a mental health problem? And Paul Voigtler, as I said, the senior author, put together a cartoon graph that he said I could use for presentations like this because it illustrates it so well. So this is the number of recommendations met. And what he's done is he set the kids who met only 1 to 3 as kind of the high point for referral, and asked the question, did following any of those recommendations reduce the number? Was it associated with a reduction in referral rate? And it was, as you can see. And how about the kids who met 7 to 9 of the recommendations? And again, even greater reduction. So we are protecting our children, reducing their risk for needing mental health problems, which is, of course, a family problem. I mean, it's not just a child when it's the child. So, and then they did multiple regression analyses. And of course, we could alleviate a lot of suffering by ensuring that children ate better and followed these guidance rules. But in addition, they asked the question, how many fewer physician visits were there for each recommendation? And for every additional recommendation met, there were 15% fewer physician visits for a mental or behavioral disorder. Well, that translates into our mental health care budget, which is a very quickly growing problem across all of Canada, across all of the world. And obviously, this is someplace where we could save money as a society. Now, I said to you that there were many, many, many more treatment studies. So I wanted to move to them because this is really where you put the nail in the coffin, where people say to me, oh, there's not very much proof that nutrition influences behavior or mental health. Believe me, there's tons of research. So I'm going to divide it into 2 groupings and just give you samples from each. The first grouping in the treatment studies are where people are taught to eat a whole foods, what we might call a Mediterranean style of diet. So these are 4 independent studies, and I always give you the first author, the journal, and the year. So if you want to look up any reference, you can find it. And they're all randomized trials, and they're not randomized placebo controlled, because I don't know what a placebo would be for a diet like this, but each one has an active comparison group. Okay. And all of them lasted 3 to 12 weeks. And I think I neglected pointing out that these are all in adults with depression who were not eating a stellar diet upon entry. And I have not asked for permission to group their results together, but I do it for teaching purposes because they were very consistent, and I don't have time to go into methodology of every study. First of all, notice that even with depression, diet modification was possible. This is so important. It's important for clinicians to know, because clinicians have raised their hands in my talks and said, my patients are too depressed to change their diet. Well, in one of them, everybody met criteria for major depressive disorder. Now, yes, they did get coaching and they got support, but they could do it. And by the way, even if it's just anybody in the audience listening thinking I'm too depressed to change the way I eat, I think that you you can change your mind about that by the end of this talk. A second finding across all of them was that those who had been assigned to the dietary intervention improved the most if they showed, I'm saying this badly, sorry. All of them had a comparison group of peer counseling or something like that. But those whose diets improved in the diet group improved the most, showed the most improvement in mood. So the more adherent they were to the recommendations, the better they got. And then I pick out the JACA study. First of all, it was the first one to show this, but more importantly, they looked at something that is never included in studies of antidepressant medications or anything. They asked the question, how many people went into remission? That means at the end of their study, and theirs was 12 weeks long, at the end of the study, how many no longer met criteria for the diagnosis of major depressive disorder? And in that study, their comparison group was peer counseling. And isn't it great to see that that resulted in 8% remission? Because, I mean, that's powerful. And many of you might be doing psychotherapy. Many of you might be just supporting your friends, helping. And you can see how important that is. It's not all about nutrition, folks. We are human beings with complex needs, and peer counseling is very, very important. But of course, the really gobsmacking result was that a third of those who had been randomized to get the dietary education and counseling were in remission after 12 weeks. I think even they were stunned. This is, if anyone ever hears of an antidepressant drug resulting in remission of a third in 12 weeks with no side effects, please let me know, but you won't. It hasn't been shown yet anyway. And one other thing in that same study is that they did a cost analysis. Now, we have a myth out there that you've got to help me dispel. People think I eat ultra-processed stuff because it's cheaper. It is not cheaper. And they're the first ones to collect the data to prove it, but I'm going to talk to you about it a little bit more later. They actually collected the information of the weekly cost of food prior to joining the study. And remember, these are people who were not eating particularly well. And these were in Australian dollars. And then after they went on the recommended diet, and it decreased by almost 20%. Those of us who have watched people put money into vending machines and spend money in places like 7-Elevens where there is no food, it's only ultra processed chemicals except for the milk section, are not surprised by this. But you have to actually keep track to see it in yourself. The last area of treatment studies is the one where I did most of my research before I retired, and that was in the area of micronutrients in pill form. So we have to ask this question: why might a good whole foods type of diet, which should always be our first step, but why isn't it enough for everybody? I mean, our dietitians have been telling us forever, just eat a healthy diet and you'll be fine. Well, there are a number of reasons, and I don't have time to go into them here, but I'll just mention them briefly. One is individual differences, and I referred to that earlier. Excuse me. We know of congenital differences in the physical health realm. We think they're probably present in the brain health realm, though we don't have adequate data yet. And more importantly, we don't have any tests of what an individual brain needs. And I'm hoping someone in my lifetime will figure out how to evaluate this. But right now, many of you, I'm sure, are sent for blood tests. That's peripheral blood. It's not what's in the brain. Maybe you have your metabolomic variables evaluated. I understand these are all attempts to evaluate what a person needs to take, but we don't have any way of comparing that to what your brain needs. So you over there sitting in the first row, if we were in person, you might need more magnesium than I do for optimal cellular function. And you over there in the fourth row might need more zinc than I do. And I might need more B6 than all of you. We can't evaluate that. And that's one of the reasons I think why the broad spectrum formulas have had more powerful effects, because they're kind of a shotgun, but at levels that are safe to catch all of us who have little gaps and holes in our needs. The other area, which is so important, and we have a half a chapter in our book, but I just can't get into it here, is that we have soil problems. And we have a chapter, this half chapter on the microbiome of the soil that should be, everyone should be educated about. I pretty much said that, so I'm going to skip over it and talk to you about the kinds of research using supplemental nutrients. And these are mostly micronutrients. I've already told you to ignore the single nutrients, and you know why now. And don't ask me which nutrient you should take, because I'm going to turn back to you and say, tell me one that you shouldn't. I mean, we need them all and in balance. And so the broad spectrum studies, there are more than 60 good studies, and they all have 25 to 30 of the minerals and vitamins that we know are needed. But in between those two categories, this slide is a digression, but because of this audience and the interest in resilience, I just never know where to include it, but I have to mention this. We have the single nutrients. You can ignore the data on those. I mean, vitamin D alone is never going to fix depression. It helps some people. It's a good vitamin, but just ignore them. And the multi-nutrient formulas that I'm going to summarize for you. But in between, we have B complex. There is a solid body of randomized placebo-controlled trials which have shown that not in clinical samples, not in people with generalized anxiety disorder, but just in the general population of people going about their daily business, but having a stressful period because of a crisis, an exam, a death in the family, then taking a B complex once a day after breakfast, always with food, okay, improves their resilience. And every one of these is a placebo-controlled trial. So it's something to consider. If I've never heard of it actually solving a clinical problem, but it seems to improve general resilience. And we know our brains need a lot of B vitamins. So last but not least, I'm giving you some summary information about the broad spectrum approach. I refer to the Alberta formulas here because the vast majority of the studies are on the Alberta formulas, and that'll be on my next slide. But we have some European studies in here that have used 25, 28 micronutrients, unfortunately not in forms that can be replicated, but at any rate, these are pooled together. And Julia Ruckledge, who's a former student here at University of Calgary, and who I supervised for her thesis research and co-author of the book. She's at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand now, and she's great with summary slides, amongst other things. So she put together a summary of all these, and you can see the results are quite powerful, but look at what the common theme is. And we're finding this in every country, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, where these formulas are being studied. Improved emotion regulation, calming, decreased irritability, and anger. So I have one slide on what the Alberta formulas are. I always hate to show it, frankly, because then people accuse me of being affiliated with them. If I were studying Ritalin and I showed you that something about and named the drug company, you wouldn't accuse me of that, but somehow it always happens in the nutrition world. So let me say again, I am not affiliated with them, never have been. None of the scientists in New Zealand, Canada, or the US who has ever studied their formulas has ever taken any of their money. In fact, it is the only truly independent research we have in mental health, because all of the drug studies are affiliated pretty much with pharmaceutical companies. So we took this stand that we didn't want to be part of that, what we see as a corruption of the mental health literature. But the companies, you can find them, you can talk to them, look at their formulas on those two websites. And they're very similar because they started out as one company and they split in two. Okay, here's a summary slide with respect to ADHD. Julia put this together because she did these are all placebo-controlled RCTs. This is in adults, and she did the adult study and this first child study. And then the third study is in children, and that was a multi-center trial run by Jenny out of Oregon Health and Sciences. Second site was Ohio State University, and the third was the University of Lethbridge. So 3 institutions, 2 countries, and this one was just published in the Journal of American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. The reason we can compare them, excuse me, I try to mute the microphone when I'm going to cough, is that they all use the Clinical Global Index, which looks at overall improvement, and they all used Alberta formulas. and they were all blinded. So the blue bars are the improvement on the micronutrients, and the orange are on placebo. This is a high bar that they've set because this isn't just improvement. This is meeting the much to very much improved. And when Julia looked at people long-term, not surprisingly, people say they keep improving. We think that they're repleting bodily stores or something, who knows? At any rate, a year later, the children who stayed on the micronutrients, over 70% were in the much to very much improved, whereas medication was down here and some people were doing nothing. So I'm going to make a bold evidence-based statement before I make some concluding comments. With 3 placebo-controlled RCTs, it takes only 2 to get FDA approval of a drug, but nobody's looking for drug approval here. But it's a very high bar to reach, and it has been reached. Plus, I don't have time to go over the case series, within subject crossover reports, all peer-reviewed, 3 countries fully replicating each other. I think no child should be treated first with medication when presenting with meltdowns, ADH, and emotion dysregulation. I'm not saying they should never be treated with medication. That would be stupid. But first, what we should be doing is feeding their brains, teaching them life skills and nutrition, improving their lifestyle, and so forth. Medication should be considered later on if a supplement is required. I have a summary of some resilience research to really drive home the point about resilience. I started 10 minutes late. So I don't know if I can I think I will keep going because I'm willing to stay more than an hour, and I guess they're going to let me do that. So I'm going to show you 2 slides. There were these tremendous earthquakes in New Zealand that Julia was in the middle of doing clinical trials on some of the Alberta formula stuff. And then we had the flood in southern Alberta, and then back in New Zealand, Julia was coping with the mass murder in 2 mosques and the outfall from that. So we put together the data from all of that, and it was very, very consistent about how resilience and recovery from this trauma, all these traumas, was much better in people who were taking micronutrients. So again, we could compare across studies because we all use the same measure, depression, anxiety, and stress scale. And we all looked at people over several weeks. The endpoint was 4 to 6 weeks. And the question was, who got down into the normal stress range? And this was after one of the earthquakes, and this was a randomized trial. This was after our flood in southern Alberta. Some of you may remember it. And this was a randomized trial. This was not a randomized trial. These were the people who, following the massacres, asked Julia for help, and they were monitored clinically. This is the comparator for the earthquake. And that was, unfortunately, I have to say this to those of you who do counseling, this was kind of this is treatment as usual, okay? And so it's not that it's no help, but it certainly was not as effective as quickly as micronutrients. And then in the flood, we had another comparator of a single nutrient, vitamin D, and that's where that ended up. So you can see how powerful micronutrients can be for improving resilience. So, I'm closer to the end than I thought. I have a few suggestions for you. What do I not recommend as the first step for those of you wanting to improve your diets? I do not recommend starting with specialty diets. They're highly restrictive. And especially if you're working counseling with people who have a lot of depression, they don't need another failure experience because they tried the paleo diet or some of these others and they couldn't follow it, and they just feel worse about themselves than ever. So I'm not saying, I know some people get much better on these diets, and research proves that, but I wouldn't start there. I think it's much more practical as a first step to learn how to choose real food and not ultra-processed products where you're better off eating the boxes they come in than eating what's in them. And by the way, you usually do not need a dietitian referral for this sort of thing. You really only need to say, to work with people to figure, and I have lots of hints that I don't have time to go into here, but ways to improve your diet with a general improvement. Remember, over 50% of what's going into the mouth of the person sitting in front of you probably is devoid of micronutrients. You've got a big gap there that you can fill by just moving them into that. So it's very important for you to know what a Mediterranean style diet looks like. But most important is that, and of course, vegetarian's not going to eat the meat, but I mean, you accommodate these things. But it's most important for you to learn how to save money. There is nothing cheaper or quicker, the combination of the two, to eat than lentils. And I've put into Google recipes, lentils, and I think I put in greens or spinach or something. And I had 7 million recipes in less than 1 second. That's what you can do for really saving money and improving your diet. But all of the beans and legumes, now some of these take more time, and if you don't have an Instapot or whatever, buy the canned ones. They're still very inexpensive. Put them in a colander first, rinse them, and you've gotten rid of the excess sodium, and then find recipes. There are so many things you can do, and that is where the bucks can be saved, okay? OPI, this is one of the Australian groups, put out some very logical suggestions for how to go about improving your diet. I forgot to ask whether you would have access to my slides after this talk, but I can give them to anyone who wants to read through these later. Notice this point, go through a 2-week taper to eliminate sugar addiction. That's got to be a high priority for many people. And then there's the why. Learn why. And I have a 5-minute video on those metabolic steps that everyone's welcome to watch. For some reason, it's in my private YouTube channel right now, and I haven't been able to change that, but it's linked on my website. You can find it there or email me. Some important footnotes for you to know is that everything I've shown you about mental health also pertains to cognitive decline and dementia, and there's a really rapidly growing research on that. And this is a question I often get asked. Why can't I just take an over-the-counter multivitamin and mineral formula? Well, you can. There's nothing wrong with them. As far as I know, I haven't tested them. That's the problem. No one studied them. But there is very little scientific evidence of benefit for mental health problems. In fact, the first study that showed some benefit for reduced cognitive decline, it wasn't really mental health, but cognitive decline, just came out in the last month. And so we need more research on it. Again, anyone interested in doing studies, I have a list this long. But right now, I'd say just don't expect too much of them, because mostly they are not broad spectrum enough, and they are not a sufficient dose. If you're looking for one, be sure to look for one that's got lots of minerals, because that's what they have skimped on in the past. And the third and final important footnote is, if you're looking at the broad spectrum formulas like the Alberta formulas, at therapeutic doses, they will amplify the effect of psychiatric medications, as they should. And I mean, we have research back to the 1990s showing that increased nutrition enables people to get along on a lower amount of psychiatric medication. That's a good news story, but it does require a bit of additional knowledge if you're adding a broad spectrum formula to medications. So you need to look into that, contact me, or I'll direct you to some resources. And this is one of the resources I would probably direct you to. I think it will be posted next month. And there's a 2-part series coming out from the Psychopharmacology Institute, which is psychopharmacologyinstitute.com, by Dr. Amelia Gomez, who is an integrative child and adolescent psychiatrist who has worked with well over 200 children now clinically, using broad spectrum formulas, mostly the Alberta ones. And she said this to me in April. I said, can I quote you? And she said, yeah. I said, can I put it on a slide? She said, yes. So there it is. And I think it's important for clinicians to know this. This is when the scope of practice of both psychologists and psychiatrists. There is no problem educating people about whole food, about introducing them to the research on micronutrients. And what people like Amelia say is that their career gets a lot better because they just want to help people, you know. This is what you'll find on my website, lots of videos and all. Julie has an excellent TEDx talk. You can just go to YouTube and search for her last name. She also has a free MOOC, a massive online open course on edx.org. And let's see, in summary, we are starving our brains. Mental health care is in crisis. I hope I've convinced you that these two things are associated. Not that it's the only explanation, but why aren't we paying more attention to it? The message today should feel empowering to you because we can all do better. And my final slide, the facts are out there and they do not cease to exist because they are ignored. That's why we wrote our book, and that's why I have given over 120 talks like this in the last year, and I'm certainly open to any educational opportunities.